Step with me into the mountains. You are pressed against cold stone, in a valley so narrow you could throw a spear across it. Above you, the peaks of what will one day be called the Picos de Europa rise into grey cloud. Below, along the valley floor, a column of soldiers is filing through. Helmets, spears, the discipline of an army that has already conquered most of a peninsula in a handful of years. They do not know you are here. Or they know and they do not think it matters. You are a remnant. A scattering of Visigothic nobles and refugees who fled north when everything else fell, hiding in mountains too poor and too high for anyone serious to bother conquering. Your leader is a man named Pelayo. He was not long ago a man of some standing at a royal court that no longer exists. Now he is the last thing resembling a king that this corner of Spain has left, and he has just done something that should get every one of you killed. He refused to pay the tax. He attacked the garrisons. He gave the empire that swallowed an entire kingdom in 7 years a reason to send soldiers into these mountains to finish the job. And here they come, marching into a valley so narrow that they cannot spread out, cannot maneuver, cannot do any of the things that made their army unstoppable everywhere else. You have heard, if you have heard of this battle at all, that it was 300 men against 100,000. A miracle, a holy slaughter. No one alive in the year 722 wrote that number down. You have probably heard the version with the big numbers. 300 defenders, 100,000 attackers, a cave. A miracle so total it reads like scripture. It is a magnificent story. There is no contemporary source that says it. So what actually happened in this valley in the summer of the year 722? And why does an engagement so small that the winning side's own enemies barely bothered to record it end up, 8 centuries later, remembered as the moment a nation was born? Because here is the strange truth about Covadonga. Its size does not matter nearly as much as what it started. A rebellion that should have been crushed in an afternoon instead lit a fuse that took 770 years to finish burning, and along the way the story grew so much larger than the event that separating the two is most of the work. This is the real battle, not the legend on the plaque. What the evidence actually supports, and why the exaggeration doesn't erase what genuinely happened here. If you want history with the myths clearly marked, the real evidence, the honest uncertainty, and the moments later storytellers couldn't resist improving, subscribe and walk with us. To understand why a handful of refugees were hiding in a mountain valley at all, you have to understand how fast the world they knew had come apart. In the year 711, an Umayyad force crossed from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal. The kingdom they found there, ruled by the Visigoths, was not a weak or primitive state. It had governed the peninsula for roughly 2 centuries, with its own laws, its own church councils, its own royal court. But it was also a kingdom with deep internal divisions, a contested succession, and as it turned out, remarkably little capacity to survive a sustained, competent invasion. It did not take decades. It took in real terms only a handful of years. The Visigothic king was killed early in the fighting. City after city fell, some through battle, many through negotiated surrender on terms that let local elites keep their land and their faith in exchange for tribute and submission. Within a short span, the vast majority of the peninsula, nearly all of it, was under Umayyad control. For the people who did not want to submit, there was almost nowhere left to go. Almost nowhere except north, into the mountains of Asturias, a rugged, poor, difficult country in the far north that held little appeal for a conquering administration focused on the peninsula's wealthier heartlands. Visigothic nobles, clergy, and ordinary refugees who could not accept the new order drifted into those mountains and gathered around whatever leadership remained. That is the world Pelayo stepped into. Not the ruler of a kingdom, the last standing piece of one. Pelayo, sometimes rendered Pelagius, was not a nobody plucked from obscurity by fate. He came from real standing in the world that had just collapsed. His father, Favila, had been a dignitary at the court of the Visigothic king Egica, one of the men who had actually run the machinery of the kingdom before it fell. Pelayo himself is remembered in some accounts as having served among the royal bodyguard. Around the year 718, the scattered remnants gathered in Asturias did something that mattered more than any battle they organized. They elected Pelayo as their princeps, their leader, their prince in the old sense of a chosen war leader rather than a hereditary monarch. It was not a coronation. It was a survival committee choosing its most capable member, and Pelayo did not choose quiet survival. He made a decision that on its face looks close to suicidal. He refused to pay the jizya, the tax imposed on non-Muslim populations under Umayyad rule, the basic mechanism by which conquered peoples were absorbed into the new order without needing to be constantly resubdued by force. Refusing it was not a technicality. It was a declaration that this small mountain community did not consider itself conquered. He went further. He began attacking Umayyad garrisons directly, not in open battle, which his tiny following could never have survived, but in the kind of harassment that mountain country makes possible. Strike, withdraw, disappear into terrain the enemy does not know as well as you do. This is the part of the story that gets lost under the later legend of the miraculous battle. Before Covadonga was ever fought, Pelayo had already spent months making himself enough of a nuisance that someone in the Umayyad administration decided the mountain rebels needed to be dealt with permanently. The response came from the regional Umayyad governor, a man named Munyuza. Rather than march north himself, Munyuza dispatched a force under a general named Alkama to go into the mountains and end the rebellion before it could become anything larger than an irritation. This, from a purely military standpoint, should not have been difficult. A trained, equipped Umayyad column against a scattering of refugees and minor nobles with no real army, no fortress, no supply lines, the outcome should have been a formality. But Alkama's force had to go where Pelayo's people had chosen to make their stand, and that location did almost as much of the work as anything the defenders did with their own hands. The valley near Covadonga is narrow enough, by every account, that an army accustomed to fighting in open formation simply could not spread itself out. There was no room to outflank, no room to bring superior numbers to bear all at once, no room to do any of the things that make a large disciplined force devastating against a smaller one on open ground. The column advancing into that gap could only ever fight as a thin, exposed line, funneled between rising slopes on either side. And on those slopes, Pelayo's people had the one advantage that mountain terrain always offers the side that knows it best: height. Height to see the column coming. Height from which to throw stones and loose arrows down onto men who could not easily climb up to answer in kind, who could not easily retreat back through their own advancing column, who were, in the plainest sense, trapped by the geography of the place they had marched into. This is not a story about superior numbers overcoming impossible odds through faith alone. This is a story about a small force choosing exactly the ground on which a much larger force's advantages stopped mattering. What happened next did not take long by the standards of ancient warfare, and it did not need to. Caught in a valley they could not maneuver in, under fire from positions they could not easily assault, Alkama's column began to break apart. Alkama himself was killed in the fighting. The Umayyad commander sent to end the rebellion did not survive the attempt. The defeat did not end there. Munyuza, the governor who had ordered the expedition, would not escape the consequences either. In the aftermath, he was pursued and killed at a place called Proaza, his own attempt to flee or regroup cut short. 2 Umayyad commanders dead. A punitive expedition destroyed. And a rebellion that had started with a handful of refugees refusing a tax now standing as the force that had beaten back the empire that had conquered nearly the entire peninsula in under a decade. We're separating what actually happened here from what later chroniclers needed it to mean. If you want history that shows its evidence rather than just its legend, the membership link is in the description. Now the number everyone remembers and why it doesn't hold up. Here is where we have to be honest about what we do not and cannot know. The figure you have almost certainly heard, 300 defenders against 100,000 attackers, appears in none of the sources closest to the actual event. It is not in a contemporary chronicle. It is not in any Umayyad administrative record. It is, as far as the evidence allows us to say, a later embellishment, a number that grew because the story needed to grow, not because anyone counted heads on that valley floor in 722. The problem runs deeper than one suspicious number. Our actual written accounts of the battle come from Christian chronicles composed by Mozarab writers, Christians living under Muslim rule in the late 9th century. That is not a small gap. That is more than a century and a half after the men who actually fought at Covadonga were dead. No one who wrote down the story we inherited had spoken to a survivor, seen the ground, or checked the numbers against any administrative record. They were writing origin mythology for a kingdom that by their own time badly needed one. And the two sides did not even agree on what kind of event it had been. Christian accounts describe the fighting in the most dramatic terms available: slaughter, miracle, divine intervention. Muslim sources from the period, where they mention it at all, describe something closer to a minor skirmish, an irritation dealt with, and then absorbed into the much larger, much more successful story of the wider conquest. This was not, to the Umayyad administration, managing an enormous new territory, a defining catastrophe. It was a bad afternoon for one expeditionary column in an unimportant corner of a very large map. Modern historians, working from what limited archaeological and textual evidence survives, suggest the real numbers were almost certainly far smaller than the legend, and probably less lopsided than 100 to 1, while still very likely favoring the Umayyad side numerically. The Christian force may have run into the low thousands once you count the wider gathering of refugees and local fighters, not the 300 of the legend. The Umayyad force is estimated, cautiously, at something more than 1,000, a real, meaningful column, but nothing close to 100,000 men marching into a mountain pass. None of this means nothing happened. A real ambush occurred in a real valley, and 2 real Umayyad commanders really died there. What it means is that the version passed down to us was shaped, over a century and a half of retelling, by people who needed a founding miracle far more than they needed an accurate headcount. We made something for people who want the real evidence, not just the epic version, the kind of history that survives the fact check. If you want to carry a piece of that, the link is in the description. Set the exaggerated numbers aside, and what is left is still genuinely significant, just significant in a different way than the legend suggests. Covadonga did not reconquer Spain. It did not even reconquer Asturias in any complete sense. What it did was give a scattered group of refugees led by a minor Visigothic noble with no crown and no kingdom, something they had not had before, a foothold that held. Out of that survival, Pelayo's followers organized something more permanent, the Kingdom of Asturias, a small mountainous Christian state that would, unlike so many other pockets of resistance across the collapsing Visigothic world, actually endure. It endured because Umayyad Spain, for reasons of geography and priorities that had little to do with any single battle, largely left it alone. The mountains that made Covadonga winnable for Pelayo's people also made Asturias unappealing to conquer properly, poor, rugged, and simply not worth the sustained military investment that finishing the job would have required when there were richer, easier territories elsewhere to consolidate. So the kingdom survived, not through a single miracle, through terrain, priorities, and one small ambush that happened to succeed at exactly the right moment to matter. And from that one surviving foothold over the following centuries, a slow, uneven, frequently interrupted process began. The gradual expansion of Christian-ruled territory back across the peninsula, kingdom by kingdom, campaign by campaign, over a span of time that is almost impossible to overstate. Historians conventionally mark the beginning of that process at Covadonga in 722. They mark its end at the fall of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom in Iberia, in the year 1492. 770 years. That is the distance between the skirmish in the mountain valley and the completion of the story it is credited with starting. Here is what stays with you. Almost no one on either side, in the summer of 722, thought they were witnessing the birth of a kingdom that would take nearly 8 centuries to fulfill its promise. The Umayyad administration treated it as a minor setback in an otherwise overwhelmingly successful conquest. The defenders themselves were fighting in the moment simply to survive the next few hours in a narrow valley. Not to found a nation, not to begin a centuries-long reconquest, just to not die that afternoon. The meaning arrived later. It arrived because people who came after needed a beginning, a clean founding moment they could point to and say, "Here, this is where it started, this is where we refuse to disappear." And once that need existed, the actual modest, geographically lucky ambush was no longer sufficient. It had to become 300 against 100,000. It had to become a miracle, because an ordinary survival story is much harder to build a national identity on than a divine one. That does not make the underlying event meaningless. It makes it more human. A cornered group of people, led by a man with more titles in his past than in his present, chose their ground carefully, used the only advantage they actually had, and survived a fight they had every reason to lose. That is not a miracle. It is something better, a demonstration of what a small, desperate, well-positioned resistance can actually accomplish without any of the embellishment later generations felt they needed to add. The valley is quiet now. The numbers on the plaque are still wrong. But the kingdom that grew out of that narrow gap in the mountains was real, and it did, eventually, finish what it started. Covadonga was not the only ancient battle where a small force's defiance got mythologized into something larger than the evidence supports. A world away and centuries earlier, 10,000 Spartans marched out to avenge the most famous last stand in history, and that story has its own exaggerations worth untangling. That story is next. Click it, and walk with us further into